Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the invitation to be here at such a grand occasion. Congratulations, Eva, on the first 50 years. And 50 years, that's quite an achievement. I happen to know, because I previously reached that particular milestone. And let's not dwell on that. We're not here to discuss my midlife crisis. But you know, if you ever saw that old movie, Lethal Weapon, with Mel Gibson and Danny Glover, when Danny Glover says, "I'm getting too old for this shit," he was 41 years old. So let's just say this, there is a slight tendency, as you grow older, to look back to the past and think that there were some good old days back there that you would like to recreate. I recently read a study where they had played music to people, songs that they hadn't listened to before, and asked them, so how would you rate this on a scale from 1 to 10? And it turned out that almost all music that was created before they were born was considered bad, uninteresting. But then as the music approached their date of birth, music got better. And once they were born, music created the same year were considered very good. And then it only got better until their late teens. And then, unfortunately, music got worse again, and much worse, so progressively. So when you're 50, music that's created when you're 50 is twice as bad as music created when you're 40 years old. Now, interestingly, this goes for all other areas of the human experience. When you ask people, so when was the economy doing its best? When were sports performances the best? When were people the most moral? When were people decent? When was life good and incomes decent? People always say that between the years of 5 and 25, it was great. And then increasingly, it gets worse. And this goes for every generation. So the music that was created when we were 15, the best music that had ever been created, was obviously considered by a previous generation as the worst form of decadence. So it tells you that it's not the world that's faulty, it's us. We have an inbuilt tendency to think that our own intellectual and physical deterioration is the world's deterioration and stagnation. And why am I saying this on the 50th birthday of Eva? I'm saying this because it means that we need to let go of our gut instinct and our feelings about what the world is like. And we have to rely on data. We have to look at the science, at economics and at history to realize where we are and where we can possibly go in the future. Because if you do that, rather than asking people about their guts, and look at what's happened in the world since 1974, when EVA was founded, we see something very different. Not that life in the past was so much better, but on the contrary, and bear with me for a few data points. Since 1974, if we measure global wealth by GDP per capita, adjusted for local prices and inflation, more than 60% of all the wealth that the average person has ever created was created during these 50 years. Poverty has declined. Extreme poverty, as measured by the World Bank, has declined from more than 4 out of 10 people around the world living in extreme poverty to fewer than 1 out of 10 people in the world today. More than a decline by 3/4. And if the average person in Finland from 50 years ago on an average wage would appear here today amongst us, he or she would be considered desperately poor if we use any of the popular relative poverty measures that are out there. Life expectancy around the world during these 50 years has increased from 58 to 74 years, which means that the average person could celebrate every birthday in the past 50 years by just approaching death by less than 9 months, and not 12, as you would usually expect. And most, hopefully, cheeringly, child mortality has declined since then by roughly 3/4. In other words, the only excuse for the good old days is a bad memory and the fact that we forgot how hard the world was back then. Now we live in the best era ever if we look at objective indicators of human living standards. And I'm not saying that all of this is thanks to EVA's work, but let's just say a substantial part of it is for sure. Because as the Prime Minister just pointed out, you have been pioneers when it comes to the ideas that made this development possible. Because it happened in certain places, in certain periods, when people got more freedom and security. You have been pioneers in presenting these ideas, definitely in Finland, but also in influencing us in other countries around the world, and definitely in Sweden. And if I were to just summarize what I take as the key message in two basic principles that have to be hammered home again and again, one economic principle and one geopolitical principle. The first one, in Margaret Thatcher's beautiful formulation, is that the problem with socialism and big government is that sooner or later you will run out of other people's money. But there is a mirror principle when it comes to geopolitics. The problem with appeasing authoritarians and aggressors, the problem with appeasement is that sooner or later you will run out of other people's countries, and then they will come for yours. And that's why we have to stick up for freedom individually, economically, and for our nations as well. You will discuss geopolitics later on, but I'm here for the economy and for free markets. And I'm delighted to be doing that, because I happen to think that most of this development comes from people having more opportunities in shaping their own economic fortunes in these past 50 years. Poverty doesn't require an explanation. That's our starting point. That's what happens before we start to build better technologies, production methods, distribution and trade forms, goods and services, and financial institutions that improve our world. Everything that we have has to be thought out, invented, created, tested in competition and tweaked into something that creates value for other human beings. And that's what economic freedom does. There is an international research project called the Economic Freedom of the World Project, led by the Fraser Institute in Canada, where they are trying to measure the economic freedom of countries around the world. And it's interesting in itself to see how you are doing, and Finland is doing relatively well. Place 17, to put that in context, you share 17th place with Sweden. Astonishingly, at exactly 7.81 points on a 10-point scale, which is interesting. Tells you something about how close we are, but it differs, and it's interesting to see where it differs as well. But it also tells us how far we have to go. There's still some place left to get to the top 10. But what's also interesting about this project is that then you can find lots of correlations between how free economies are and how well they're doing. And that pattern is so obvious, it beats you over the head when you read these studies. You notice that if you divide countries in quarters according to their economic freedom, free enterprise, free trade, safe property rights, free financial markets, limited government, and so on, the freest quarter is 10 times wealthier than the least free quarter. In the least free quarter, poverty rates are 30 times higher than in the freest quarter. Infant mortality is 10 times higher in the least free quarter. And interestingly, life expectancy is 15 years longer in the freest quarter of economies. 15 years longer, which means that in free countries, 50 is the new 35. And this is something that has to be told as well. Economics is not about economics. It's about everything, every capacity that we get once we can create more. And that includes longer lives. So what free markets really mean is 15 years more of life, which is the difference of perhaps having grandkids and seeing them grow up. So free enterprise, free markets is not really about sort of fancy watches and fast cars. It's about the chance of possibly meeting your grandkids. That's what free economics is about. Some say that these ideas are imported, that it's strange to talk about free markets in Finland and in Sweden. It's an Anglo-Saxon phenomena. Far from it. These are universal ideas. Ideas about human dignity and freedom and the limited capacity of command and control systems. Those are universal ideas because human nature is universal. And in fact, some of these ideas originated here, even before EVA. You know, this is the Ostrobotnian banquet hall, right? That guy up there is Anders Chydenius, the great hero of Finland and Sweden in the mid-18th century, when he developed ideas about free markets and the invisible hand 11 years before Adam Smith did the same thing, and who in the Swedish parliament implemented the freedom of the press statute, uniquely early abolishing the censorship principles. Anders Chydenius is a hero to each and every one of us. One of the reasons why I objected to Finland joining the euro currency, so you don't have Anders Chydenius on the bills anymore. Was it the 500 mark or something like that? That's a shame, but I still have one back home. He's a hero to each and every one of us because he realized something important. And what was that basic insight? That basic insight that's still relevant today is a simple truth, that initiative and effort does not come from the top. It comes from more people being allowed to look around for new solutions to our problems and allowed to experiment with strange new ways of working, creating business models, new technologies. And the more people who are allowed to search for solutions, the greater the chance that we'll end up with some good ones. And the prize mechanism alone, combined with our own interest in improving the lives of ourselves and our loved ones, will coordinate the economy much better than any centralized authority could do, and point us to the places where we can go to create more value for other people. That's what he realized. And looking at taxes, regulations, and control, Chydenius concluded, "Here lies the cord that binds the laborer's hands behind his back, and the potion that renders citizens feeble and drowsy." He realized that if people were allowed to build more value, that value will be of great importance to everybody, even those who do not create that value. Improving the economy by these 62% that I talked about since 1974. That's part of it. If we grow an economy by 1% per capita, it means that in roughly 70 years, we have doubled our incomes, roughly doubled our capacity to do things, to get things done. Now, if we could increase that to 2%, then we'd do it in some 35 years instead, doubling all of this. Compared to this, every kind of redistribution is trivial. Doubling everything, that's what, as fast as possible. That's what we should be looking for, no matter what we are interested in. Again, it's not about economics and money. It's about capacity to do things, all things. Improving our lives, extending our lifespans, coming up with better treatments to disease, to deal with environmental problem that takes new technologies and innovations and processes. Any kind of redistribution, getting a little bit more today from somebody else, is completely trivial compared to this enormous increase in wealth that comes from growth. And that's why that should be our overarching goal, no matter what we are looking for. The success of free people experimenting in improving our lives and coming up with better solutions has been challenged recently. recent crises, from the pandemic to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, has strained supply chains and gotten lots of people eager to look for a big government to step in and point us all in the right direction and to protect us and to repatriate supply chains and make them much safer. That's a complete misreading of what happened during these past 5 years. What we've seen on global display is the triumph of free individuals working on relatively free markets to adapt and improvise to get us out of crises that would historically result in food shortages and major disasters. That's not really what happened. During the COVID pandemic, the whole world shut down. And I'm sure that some of you did what I did, started to hoard canned food and some toilet paper, because if the world is shutting down, people are not allowed to leave their homes, we won't have goods and services anymore. Shops will close. And in that case, we need something in our basements or to protect us. But as a friend of mine who's a little bit of a prepper, who really has his basement full of stuff, said, the most embarrassing time in human history to be a prepper was in the spring of 2020. Because for a few days, there was a lack of some varieties of pasta and canned food and toilet paper. It took a couple of days, and then everything was back on shelves. How on earth did that happen? Not because of any kind of supply chain czar pointing everybody in a particular direction. Because Chydenius' insight is that's not possible. The real experts are out there, plowing the fields, working in the factories and in the offices. They are the ones who have direct knowledge about what goes on in an unpredictable world that's rapidly changing. They were the only ones who knew, oh gosh, what do I do now? I don't have these inputs for the goods that I'm producing. These particular workers will not arrive. In that case, what can I do instead? Is there a way of tweaking the process, to use other inputs, to reroute supplies, to make people who actually appear at work do something else than they did before? And by doing that and rapidly changing everything, they rebuilt supply chains in a matter of days. That's a remarkable achievement, specifically because we never really talked about it, because it happened so fast, so silently. Because all of you working out there in businesses, you worked around the clock so that we didn't have to think about it. You thought about it every second of the day so that we didn't have to pay much attention to it. That's the miracle of the market economy and of exploiting as much knowledge as possible, which is always decentralized and out there, impossible to control and centralize in any way. And to me, it's kind of proves Henry David Thoreau right, the great American transcendentalist, poet, philosopher, who pointed out that it seems like trade and commerce are made of rubber because it just bounces on top of all the obstacles put in its way by nature and by the government. So they rebuilt supply chains in real time, and then Putin invaded Ukraine, and they had to do all of it again. And at first, food prices soared. We were in for an energy shock in Europe. But then, again, everybody got to work. So entrepreneurs and businessmen and workers and farmers started to change and adapt to changing relative prices, to changes in what was at hand, what kind of supplies they had. And they began to adapt and improvise once again. And now the food index from the Food and Agricultural Organization is actually 20% lower than it was before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, adjusted for overall inflation, which, as we know, was very high generally. The conclusion, once again, was that, and again, because of the prices on the energy market, people, households, businesses changed their behavior, and we began to import liquefied natural gas instead, and suddenly prices on the spot market for natural gas was down 80%. because people adapt and people change if they are free to do so. That's the problem with centralized systems. That's the problem with one-size-fits-all systems, with all the answers in advance. It cannot allow for the improvisation and the adaptation that has to happen all the time, always in every economy, but more than ever, when the world seems unpredictable and strange. That's when we need as much freedom for as many people as possible. Quite contrary to this age-old perception that we have that when there's a crisis, we need a big government, a strong man to help us out. On the contrary, that's exactly the moment when handing power to centralized authorities is the most dangerous thing that we could do. It worked because it wasn't centralized. And this is the eternal problem with big government ideas. It's the problem with all the new fancy ideas that perhaps governments should step in and sort of guide businesses to a particular objective, repatriate supply chains, or to have an active industrial policy whereby we pick winners in business, in new green technologies, and so on. The problem is that we're not adding anything. We're just replacing the wisdom of millions of people who are constantly experimenting and learning through trial and error and feedback mechanisms and adaptation. We're replacing that wisdom with just the ideological preferences of a few people at the top. That's what any kind of big government structure does. We only lose local knowledge and individual creativity. It always sounds tempting that someone says, I will fix everything. I'll deal with all these problems. Just give me power and money, and I'll take care of it all. That's the populist temptation. But the only thing that happens is that you lose what's admittedly a little bit more time-consuming, because we're actually getting there through trial and error processes because we don't know the answers to all the problems. But we lose that process, and thereby we'll come up with worse answers. And that's why every big government strongman ideologue that I've ever heard always reminds me of the old joke about a job interview. You know, you might have heard it. The guy walks up to the office and they look at his CV and they say, oh, it says here that you're quick at maths. You're doing calculations quickly. Yes, that's one of my great assets. Okay, so what's 16 times 27? That's 42. What? 42? That's not even close. No, but it was quick. And that is the problem. It's easy to give quick answers, but we don't want quick maths. We want correct maths. And it might take a little bit longer because it takes this process of actually working through the real calculations, learning from how the world is changing and adapting to that world. That's what the market economy can uniquely do. And that's why we need it so much. It worked because it wasn't centralized. And actually it worked because it was globalized. It worked because so many were involved in these supply chains. The first thing we heard during the pandemic was that this is so dangerous. This tells us that because suddenly anything can go wrong in the supply chain. There are so many parts. We need to repatriate everything, and it feels safe if we have the production back home, right? It does. It's costly, of course, if you don't specialize that much, but perhaps if it's safer. But it's not safer. Because, there's been studies done after the pandemic now that shows which supply chains functioned and which ones didn't. And counterintuitively, it turned out that international and fairly complex supply chains held up much better than shorter ones. Sounds counterintuitive, but pretty obvious. Because if you have many suppliers, it means that you have invested in many relationships, you're used to negotiating, looking into different options, and if suddenly a particular place was under lockdown and you couldn't get those supplies, you could turn elsewhere and you could improvise. Whereas if you only have one supplier and they happen to be under lockdown, that was game over. So it's basically the same old insight that we hear in the traditional proverb, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It doesn't go put all your eggs in one basket and protect it with tariffs and subsidies and regulations, because then you have a single point of failure. And most problems are local and regional by nature. And then it's important to not lose all your production as well once that storm, weather event, epidemic, or invasion comes. Then you have to be able to rely on more alternatives. One of the few instances of real shocks and shortages during the pandemic was actually American infant formula, baby formula substitute for breast milk. And why is that? That's because they had repatriated it. America had said, we want to protect our few businesses who do this, so we have lots of tariffs and we also have safety regulations, and you're not even allowed to buy it from Europe, which meant that it only took trouble in one factory in the spring of 2022 to create a national shortage. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We need openness and free trade to be able to improvise further and more. Diversification, not concentration, is the solution. So obviously from this, I conclude that Chydenius was right. We need the market economy. And we need it in more places. Every place where we are interested in learning more and coming up with new tweaks to business models and processes and innovations and technologies. And that goes for areas like healthcare and education as well. Now, I know that this is a controversial topic in Finland, and one of the few areas where Sweden has actually done more work than Finland. And I can say that because you're so far ahead of us in other areas, so I hope that's fine, and thank you for guiding us into NATO recently, by the way. But there is this sense that I get, not just in Finland, basically everywhere. Yes, profits and markets, that's fine when it comes to cell phones and furniture and stuff like that, but not the necessities in life, not our kids' education and healthcare and care for our elderly, which seems like a strange logic to me. That seems like a way of saying that, yes, we want improvements and innovation and progress when it comes to furniture, but not when it comes to the most important parts of our life. We have learned from many international comparisons and studies that it's not how much money you put into those systems that makes the great difference in output. It's how you organize them. It's how you create as much value and service as possible. And as you all know, that's difficult. That's uncomfortable because it takes change. It takes openness to new ideas and how to implement them in old organizations. We'd rather not do that, right? We'd rather just do what we've always done. That's why we need alternatives. That's why we need competition. That's why we need more freedom to choose for patients and pupils, so that we get an interest from others to introduce those difficult new methods and ideas and technologies into our system. That's why we should do it. And even giving them some profit if they succeed, if they are creating something of tremendous value to us. And obviously profits is always a controversial word, possibly something that's okay when it comes to cell phones and furniture, but not in other areas. And I think that's because we misunderstand what profit is about. It sounds like something you're taking away. It sounds like something you take from others or out of the business, out of the organization. It's not. It's what you create. It's what you build. That's the only way in which we create profits. You know, it's in any line of business. What you do is you get some funding, hire some people, you have an idea, get the technology in place and start to produce. And what does that mean? It means that if you succeed, you've made many groups of people happy. First of all, you've made customers happy because you've given them something, goods or services, that they appreciate more than the money that they hand over to you. But you also make your employees happy because you pay them and they expect payment even if you don't sell those goods and services. And you also have to pay your providers of inputs, of technology. And you also, if you've got a loan, you have to pay interest on that. So in other words, if you can make all these groups happy, of the customers, the employees, the funders, the bank, and then also the providers, and you get something left out of it, that's the profit, which will of course be heavily taxed as well. In other words, it's not something you take out of anything, it's what you get to keep of the value that you create for others. And the larger that profit is, well, in most instances, it's a sign that you've made more people happy. You've implemented more interesting models, technologies, and goods and services that weren't there before. So this whole tendency we have in the modern debate to say that there's something shameful about great profits. We have to realize that's what makes the world go around. That's how we create this value, this growth. It's the GPS that points us to, if we want to end up in the right place, to go to those places where we create most value for other people. That's what profit is about. As long as we have rule of law, safe property rights, and voluntary agreements, and no cheating, then profit is a sign that you've done something good for others. You've used society's resources and rearranged them, the resources that are out there. Natural resources, technologies, people's time and money. You've rearranged them in a form that's more efficient, creates more value for other people than otherwise would be there. So it's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to be proud of. And this is also why the whole debate about corporate social responsibility, where I think there are important factors and aspects about how you can make sure that there are more stakeholders that benefit from it. Well, the best way to get more stakeholders to benefit from your business, from your activities, is to make all these groups happy and end up with a profit that can then be reinvested and turned into more value in the future. And that's why, I mean, the whole discussion, I think that there's something wonderful about when people who've been successful want to use that wealth for the greater good, to do charity work and to help out in other areas, specifically if it's EVA and think tanks like that really provides value to the world. But they shouldn't do it because they're ashamed. They should do it because this is of great value to them. It's not, as it's sometimes said, this is a way to sort of, I've done well in the past, so now I've done so much profit and so much wealth that I think it's time to pay something back to society. It's the other way around. If you've made profits on a free market, under the rule of law, that's a sign that you've done something for society and should be proud of it. So, to conclude, where does all of this leave the Nordic countries? Obviously, everything that I'm saying applies to Finland and to Sweden and other Nordic countries as well, but actually more than others. Because, face it, it doesn't feel like it in this room, but there are few of us. We are small countries, and we might be the sort of, you know, when you're in a room, you're the smartest people in the room are possibly there, but the room is small, and most of the talent, most of the ideas, most of the opportunity, most of the potential is always somewhere else. Specifically for small countries like us, we are incredibly dependent on trade, on imports and exports, on global markets in goods, in services, in capital, in openness for people, because we need to have access to more people's brains and more ideas from other places. And since we're also getting older, we have a demographical challenge. There's some sense of risk averseness setting in any aging rich society. Therefore, we need more competition from those who might be less risk averse, or at least who are just trying something differently. That's the one way in which we are being forced to face the future and implement the new ideas and technologies and systems and processes that might seem just uncomfortable and difficult to ours. So all of the market economy is of extreme importance to Nordic countries, but more than anything, I would say, the open global economy is of crucial importance. Every idea of buy Swedish is a nightmare for Swedes. Every idea of buy Finnish is the most unfinished thing you can imagine, because by implication it means that Germans should buy German, and Norwegians should buy Norwegian, and Americans should buy American. And that's exactly where the specialization and the inflow of new ideas and competition breaks down if we enter such a world, and if there's whatever we can do to combat that new protectionist tendency is of incredible importance to Nordic countries. Of course, Anders Chydenius knew this. He wrote about this 250 years ago. But there are new challenges constantly, and new dangerous events in the world which have to be taken into consideration. So these ideas have to be, these timeless principles have to be constantly updated for new current events and current controversies, which makes me think of my all-time favorite Amazon review of a book. It was a review of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, published in 1859, but apparently the reviewer didn't think it was too late to sort of come with some encouragement and criticism. And this reviewer wrote, and I love this, he wrote, "I won't give this book more than 3 stars out of 5. I like the book, but while John Stuart Mill's arguments are sound, his examples are a little bit dated." And, which is hilarious, but he's got a point. Those examples are a little bit dated. If you read Anders Chydenius, his principles are timeless, but his examples are a little bit dated. And that's where we come in, to take these timeless, hard-earned lessons from history and from economics, learn from them, and then adapt them and tweak them to current controversies and to current events. We have to update them, fight for those principles, and that's what I think that EVA has done splendidly over these past 50 years. You're not getting old because you're fighting for timeless principles, and that makes you timeless as well. And when the going gets tough, and sometimes it will, it's worth to remember Anders Chydenius' words. "What our age tramples underfoot, the generations to come shall gather, and what now is called bold and reckless shall then be honored as truth." And that, I think, is the experience of EVA during this first half century, and it's an important lesson for the next half century. So again, thank you and congratulations on the first 50 years. Thank you.
I don't think we've done with the topic of market economy yet, and that's why I'd like to invite here on stage Mr. Björn Wahlroos. We'd all like to hear your views on why we, the Nordic countries, especially do need the market economy. Now, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Emilia. I have one up on the previous speaker. You will not be inviting me here in 20 years. That's number one. Secondly, I somehow feel that you've been inviting me here a bit too often, going back in time. But here I am again, the man who always pops up at these things. Anyway, it's not easy to sort of comment on a speaker with whom you agree with to 98% or something like that. It was a great expose, and of course I share the values, I share the vision. But let me expand in a couple of directions, and let me be and bit more detailed when it comes to Finland and Sweden in one stage, and then come up with a few concluding remarks. I'm old enough to be reminded of when the great Milton Friedman, who wrote the book Free to Choose in 1980, actually did a TV series based on the book. The TV series opened up with Professor Friedman sitting on a hill, a mountain almost, above Hong Kong. And he pointed to Hong Kong and said, look, this is the most God-forbidden, sort of forsaken place in the world. They have no resources, they have nothing. They have a decent harbor, but that's all of it. And there were almost no people here. Then beyond that, beyond those mountains, was the vast civilization of China, the incredibly rich mainland with resources, people, an old civilization. And this is 1980, and I would say go to Hong Kong and it's much wilder today, but still. What Professor Friedman said, look, this is what freedom can give you. This is what freedom can provide you with. Freedom created Hong Kong, and lack of freedom destroyed mainland China. This is 1980. Then, of course, mainland China learned a few lessons, and they realized that they at least need to provide for a free economy, semi-free economy. And of course, they benefited enormously. That's probably the single, in volume terms, the single sort of biggest argument in favor of markets in the world. I'm not saying it's my ideal country. I'm simply saying that it's a fantastic experiment in what markets can do to an economy. We have many examples. Hong Kong is far from the only one. My son moved to Dubai a couple of years ago. I hated the place, but then you really can't but be extremely impressed how you, out of a complete desert, absolutely nothing, can create a 6 million megapolis with enormous creation of wealth again. And you can go to Europe, you can look at Ireland, which was one of the poorest countries in Europe. In the 1990s, early 1990s, Ireland's GDP per capita was half of Germany's. Today it's double Germany's, just to give you a simple. And where do you think all this comes from? It comes from market economy. It comes from dynamism, from freedom. Now, I have to comment on your view on Finland and Sweden, because it's so nice to have Swedes, because you always want to say nice things about Finland, and you're just about the only people who say anything nice about Finland in these occasions. And since I'm half Swede these days, I'll try to go both ways. The fascinating thing, I think, is the argument, why do we need the economy? Why do we need economic growth? And this is a particularly important aspect which you heard from the Prime Minister in Finland today, because the big issue going forward is where the hell are we getting some economic growth into this thing, because we have not had it for 17 years, which we're very happy that Venezuela is there, because otherwise we would have the world record. Anyway, Finland has had zero growth for about 17 years. Sweden has about a percentage point and a half. So roughly, these are rough numbers. So let's do the math. If you go on, you take 1.015 and you put it up into the 17th exponent. What you come up with is about 28, 29%. So we've lost 28, 29%, a little less than a third of potential GDP creation that we could have had if we had had even the pathetic growth that Sweden has had. So how much is 28, 29% of Finnish GDP? It comes out as a number around 70 billion euros. Okay, so how much is 70 billion euros? Well, one way of looking at, just look at the deficit on the present budget, which the Prime Minister was so happy about, that's 12 million. So we could do this goddamn Sanna Marin spend 5 times over and enjoy the journey if we had just had that growth. Sanna, come back and spend it. Anyway, having done that, it's more important that actually we're talking a lot about the sote-uudistus, the great sort of healthcare and social services reform in Finland. Total expenditure, both private and public, on healthcare in Finland is 24 billion. So we could actually take both the budget deficit, 12 billion, and all of the healthcare spending, and then double it up with the 70 billion. So it's an absolutely enormous amount of money. That's what I'm trying to say. We would have no economic problems at all in this country today had we had even the pathetic growth that the Swedes have had. So that's my point. I am not going to trouble you with the math if I take Ireland as an example. Ireland has had growth north of 5%, whatever the number is, and that is an absolutely incredible number. And I know, you'll just faint and somebody will, this will create havoc if I tell you the number. So I will not. Now, why did Sweden do better than Finland? It's very interesting. Sweden had its shitty years in the 1970s and 80s. This was with Olof Palme and all the other sort of great socialist visionaries, raising taxes, God knows what happened. I'm probably screwing this up. The result was that throughout the 70s and 80s, Sweden had on average 1% less GDP growth per annum than Finland. This is when Finland actually ran up, almost matching Sweden in 2005 before everything went to pieces. Now, what happened in Sweden? Yes, the brilliant Swedish Social Democrats, Kjell-Olof Feldt, others, essentially said, look, we can't really have a folkhem. We cannot have a Scandinavian-style sort of welfare society unless we have the money, which is a great innovation. No one in Finland has thought about this. So they came up with a simple idea, we need to get the money somewhere. So where do you get money? In capitalism, you usually get money by having capitalists who make money. I go back to what Johan said about profits. You actually need to make money to have money to spend on welfare services and stuff. So what the Swedes did was very controversial, the Social Democrats. They did away with all the taxes that most piss off the rich people. So they did away with inheritance tax, gift tax, and wealth tax. Social Democrats, like that. With the result that all Swedes who had moved to England, started moving back. My good friend Stefan Persson comes from back, pays 30% capital income tax on his enormous dividends, and lives happily ever after in Sweden. I'm not sure I would do the same, but Stefan does it. With this effect, actually, Sweden created a dynamic society, a dynamic society also for startups. They don't sell out their startup companies to American funds the moment they make a little money, because they have an option. They can call on Stefan and say, look, do you want to invest in this? Instead of selling it to some Americans, they sell 20 or 30% to Stefan or someone else. So actually the fact of having capitalists is such a great thing. It is very difficult to have capitalism without capitalism. It's kind of weird. Finns always, if you look at some of the communication from our government in Finland now, where they say that the state is now going to start investing in venture capital and stuff. This is so fucking insane that you can't really believe it. The whole idea with the word capitalism is that it's someone else than the state that's doing the really heavy lifting. And you just have to get the capitalists to get capitalism to work. Now, the interesting thing in Sweden was that then after Social Democrats had made it a wonderful place for rich people, and I will, of course, I have to sort of admit that, of course, that's why I'm Swedish. And as a consequence, in came the right-wing government, and what they did was they lowered the taxes at the very lowest end by raising the earned income deduction, työtulovähennys. 5 times. Anders Borg is still very, very proud of this, with the result that it became very profitable to Swedes to get back to work, because he essentially paid no taxes at all at the lower end of the income scale. Ergo, you got an economy that actually started working. Now, this is just, I mentioned Sweden, because I think it's important to remind you that tax reductions work. You can attract a lot of resources, a lot of skill, a lot of capital, by making it profitable for the owners of those resources to shift them into your economy. And that is what Finland has screwed up. But Sweden is not the only example. I mention Sweden particularly because whenever I talk about taxes, people say, oh, you want to create this horrible America. You just want us to be very, very unequal and all that nonsense. And I say, no, that's not the point. What I'm trying to tell you is that you can have your welfare state. You can have your righteous, you can have your country full of equal citizens. You can be like Sweden, but you can still have a working economy that actually provides for the funding for that society. But of course, the world is full of other examples. It's not just Sweden. Actually, Sweden is a mediocre example, to be fair. The negative correlation between tax rates and economic growth between countries, cross-section in the world, is somewhere between 30 and 40%. It's not a sort of huge thing, but let's say that taxes explain something like a third of the different growth rates in the world. This is a very, very sort of rule of thumb kind of thing. Now, there was an interesting thing I just saw. Somebody had just done a very simple thing. They tabulated all the states of the US Union, the 50 American states, and then all the EU membership states, which I think are 27 at the moment, but I'm never sure. So there were about 77 sort of states there, and they took them by GDP per capita and ordered them. Top 30, 28 American states, 2 European countries. Now, which countries do you think they were? I'll help you out. Luxembourg and Ireland. Now, why the hell, what do you think sort of brings together Luxembourg and Ireland? What do they have in common? Low taxes. Creating an environment of freedom for entrepreneurs is slightly different setup with slightly different strategies. Ireland, as I mentioned, has gone from rags to riches in 30 years because of an open market economy allowing a chance to work. So that's it. My favorite empirical example from the later years is that last year was the first year on record that California, that wonderful state of drug-crazy addicts who come walking towards you on Market Street in San Francisco, and all the other loonies who vote Democratic, they're all there. And it has its first year ever on record of losing population. The population of California came down a tiny bit last year, because they're losing out to Texas. Texas, of course, is a horrible place filled with J.R. Ewings and other Republicans who are disgusting and who are actually sort of taking this warm resource oil out of the bosom of Mother Earth and all other horrible things. Still, Texas is doing very well. Average GDP growth in Texas over the last 10 years has actually been 3%. California has been closer to 1%. The United States average is about 2.2%. So there's any amount of evidence showing this. Let me close my numbers thing, and then I'll just come into another thing. I found a new thing today, actually, day before yesterday, that was my son. There's this new statistics on millionaires' migration. And I think this is a fascinating statistic, because they've actually compiled now for 23, 24, I think it's for 23, how millionaires moved from one country to another. 2 biggest losers, China and the UK. And the UK, because everyone is absolutely sure that the new Labour government will screw up taxation, which has been very light for rich people. And the big gainers, the biggest, United Arab Emirates, i.e. Dubai and that stuff. The second, Italy, which has introduced a new tax for foreigners. You pay 200,000 euros, no questions asked. That's everything. And of course, a classic, Switzerland. So again, what happens in the world? The sad thing is that people respond to market incentives. They go where life is good and where they don't charge that much for admission, you see. It's like going to the theater. It's always nicer to go to a theater if the ticket price is reasonably low. Now, to close all this up and get to my point, if there's so much evidence, why the hell don't our politicians realize they need to do something? I don't have an answer to that. I have a small part of an answer, which is to say that, unfortunately, economics and taxation is a story of long lags. These effects take an enormous time to actually be clearly evidenced and econometrically picked up. And as a consequence, we don't have the sort of completely black and white world. And the preference for social security, the preference for the good society is so strong that we disregard the fact in Finland in a dramatic way, where we actually love our expenditure so much that we don't even think about how to finance it. And that, of course, is truly the most depressing final outcome, because this, of course, will ultimately ruin the actually good thing that we thought we had. Now, very closing. And this goes back to sort of life was better when I was young. But it's not actually that. I want you to think back pre-2008. Go back to around the year 2000. We lived in a despicable world of dominating neoliberal thought on economics, which we today have learned is the most disgusting way of thinking about economics. We believed in open and free markets. We even believed in God, in globalization. And when we believed in all these things and we allowed our economies to develop in a direction where we deregulated them, where we lowered taxes, what did we get? We got economic growth. We got a lot more rich people, but we also eradicated poverty, particularly on a global scale, where of course China eradicated more poverty than anyone else. We created a good world where the crowning achievement in that world was peace. In sharp contrast to what most people will tell us, competitive markets, globalization created peace. We did not have very huge global conflicts. Of course, there's always some local conflict somewhere. Then comes the financial crisis, and it's another repeat of 1929, 1930. I still remember when my good friend Pentti Kouri, we went to some sort of charity thing, and the markets had just collapsed, and Pentti sort of tucked me in the side and said, "Nalle, I think we all now have to become socialists." And I mean, he was smart. He realized where this would be going. So what happened? We started regulating. Nowhere was that more evident than in financial markets and banking. We started raising taxes because that was the right thing to do. We just need to create more equality. And what did we get? We got conflict, instability, slow growth, increasing poverty. I rest my case.